Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Healing from Lyme Summit. In today's episode, I get to talk to, again, a friend and a colleague, Dr. Roger Merfri. And let me just give you a little background about Dr. Merfri. He's a chiropractic physician in Birmingham, Alabama. He's the author of Treating and Beating Fibromyalgia and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and he is an expert on fibromyalgia. And I want to connect the dots because Lyme disease looks like so many different things, and fibro is one of them. So, Dr. Merfri, thank you so much for joining us on the summit today.
Well, Dr. Ingalls, this is great. Thank you I really delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
You know, we call Lyme disease the great imitators, the great mimic. And, I've had so many people come into my practice who've been given a diagnosis like fibromyalgia. Maybe let's just start and talk a little bit about, what is fibro? I mean, how do people know if this is what they have?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there about fibromyalgia, a lot of debate whether it's even real in some circles. Unfortunately, but fibromyalgia is a syndrome. So a syndrome is a group of symptoms that people have in common, and we give it a name. In fibromyalgia, those symptoms include diffuse, achy, sometimes disabling pain, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, irritable bowel syndrome. And then the list can get quite long because they can have other issues. They can have comorbidity issues, anxiety and depression, chemical sensitivities, migraine headaches, interstitial cystitis. And, typically, I think what happens is that this individual has fibromyalgia, has these symptoms, goes to their primary care doctor, and he or she sees all those symptoms and thinks, oh my gosh, there's no way that someone can look like they do. I mean, they look okay, and yet they have all these symptoms, and their tests are usually always, pretty normal, at least in conventional tests. And they get branded sometimes as a hypochondriac, which nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, nobody would want to make up this kind of stuff. But fibromyalgia typically affects women. 98% of those who come down with fibromyalgia are women between the age of 30 and 65. And it affects about 8% of the world population right now.
Yeah, it's one of these frustrating things. You go to the doctor, and again, we see so many people that get gaslit around Lyme disease,
Yeah.
around fibro. Yeah, as you mentioned, is it a real diagnosis? And of course, it's very real, and it's very challenging, I think, for so many people to deal with. Can you talk a little bit too? I mean, I think there's this sort of crossover between fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, what we call myalgic encephalitis. What is it that's going on in this world that's affecting the brain?
Well, so there's, if you look at fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, people sometimes get diagnosed with both those things, usually erroneously diagnosed with both of them, because I really find that while they have a lot of similarities, there's some real differences between these two things. And so I talk about, if you look at a clothesline, and you on one end of the clothesline is fibromyalgia, what I call true fibromyalgia. And that individual has diffuse, achy, sometimes disabling pain, nerve pain, neuropathy, muscle pain, joint pain. And then they have fatigue, sometimes hard to even get out of bed. They always have difficulty with their sleep, either trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. They never feel refreshed when they wake up in the morning. They have low serotonin, this brain chemical called serotonin. On the other end of the scale, I have people who have true chronic fatigue syndrome. Those individuals can have trouble with their sleep, and they typically have diffuse achy pain, and they obviously have fatigue, as the diagnosis implies. But they don't always have low serotonin states, and they don't always have trouble with their sleep. In fact, for a lot of individuals with chronic fatigue syndrome, it's not that they have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, it's that they want to sleep all the time. And I see the big difference between these two is that with fibromyalgia, they may or may not have an issue with their immune system. Those with chronic fatigue syndrome definitely have an issue with their immune system. They're always fighting off some type of virus, bacterial infection, upper respiratory infection. They get random sore throats periodically. They get swollen glands. These are the individuals that really have to be careful getting out in public, because they know that they're vulnerable to catching any kind of bug that's going around.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that, infection is a trigger for fibromyalgia. Again, I see this with a lot of people with Lyme disease or any of the co-infections. Are there other underlying things that you've seen in your practice that are also causes of fibro that people need to be aware of?
Well, that's it, right? I mean, what's the cause of fibromyalgia? I mean, that's the question. And unfortunately, we really don't know the true cause, although for the last 22 years specializing in fibromyalgia, the thing that makes the most sense to me and many other healthcare specialists is this thing called central sensitization pain syndrome, where those with fibromyalgia, part of their nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, which is very stimulating, is on over alert. It's hyper vigilant. And so because of that, pain and any stimulation is magnified. So for these individuals, the pain receptors are hyper vigilant. They're registering pain in an accentuated form. And it doesn't matter where that pain is coming from. So for them, an old surgery, so scar tissue, or some type of past trauma, it could be from osteoarthritis or osteoporosis. It can be from an autoimmune disease that's triggering this. It can be from oxidative stress. It can be from other triggers that are coming, Lyme, that maybe they didn't even know they had till they got under a lot of stress. And now Lyme starts to rear its ugly head. Heavy metal toxicity, mold toxins, these things start to build up. And eventually, if this person gets under too much stress, their hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals, which are kind of controlling this autonomic nervous system, becomes compromised. And now they start to develop symptoms that eventually after a period of time, they get diagnosed with fibromyalgia.
Well, I know you have your own unique approach, and I want to talk about that in just a little bit, but can we talk a little bit just about medication? Because I know this is kind of the conventional approach for the doctors who do believe you and who are invested in treating you. Their approach is generally maybe around some physical therapy and medication. Is there a place for medication in fibro? Is it something that you advocate people do while you're working on dealing with these underlying issues? What are your thoughts on, if your doctor is recommending something like Lyrica, gabapentin, one of these medications?
Well, I find it's really pretty much a dead end. Traditional medicine has pretty much given up on fibromyalgia. And Darren, that's because over the years they've come out with new medications, saying, oh yeah, this is recommended for fibromyalgia, Lyrica, Grellis, Neurontin, gabapentin, Savella, Cymbalta. These are some of the drugs that are approved for fibromyalgia treatment. And yet when we look at the surveys, we see that after 15 years of being on common medical protocols, drug therapy alone, these individuals are no better off, and usually they're actually worse off. So what we've seen over the last decade is previously we thought, oh yeah, we'd find a drug that would be able to cover up the symptom, a typical conventional medicine approach, and they would be able to get on with their life. What we've seen though is those drugs have not really yielded much long-term success. So the practitioners have become discouraged, and they just tell their patients now, hey, we're going to put you on this medication, but you're just going to have to learn to live with it. It's really, no different than a lot of these medical misfit diagnoses where people get a diagnosis, whether it's Lyme disease or fibromyalgia and or chronic syndrome, and they're told basically that, we're going to try to treat the symptoms, but that rarely results in any long-term lasting relief for these folks.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my experience as well. And of course, most of these drugs come with a long list of side effects. And I find so many people, even if they're getting some benefit from the medication, more often than not, they end up stopping the drug because of the side effects. It gets to the point where the side effects worse than the fibro itself, and it's just not worth continuing. Walk us through your approach. If someone comes to you, they've been given this diagnosis of fibro, with or without Lyme disease, what's your thought process on, where do people really need to start, and, how do you kind of walk them through, your treatment protocols?
Well, my protocols have changed over the years. Being in practice 32
Why they
years.
call it
I
practice,
can't
right?
believe 32. I just said 32 years. And treating fibromyalgia for 22 years. In the beginning, Darren, I had a very large integrative medical practice here in Birmingham, Alabama. And we used, combination of prescription medications, a very judicious use, very limited use of these, and then more natural approaches. We had an IV clinic, we did Myers cocktails, ozone, we did hydrogen peroxide therapy, human growth hormone, did all these things. But what I found was that it became so complicated that it really backfired. We could help the patient quickly if they have trouble with their sleep by giving them trazodone. So we became very, I think, lazy in our approach with these patients because we had too many cooks in the kitchen. We had acupuncturists, we had massage therapists, we had the IV clinic, we had dietitians, we had all these people trying to help these folks, and it really became so complicated that it wasn't working. So 15 years ago or so, I sold that medical practice, and I decided, okay, I'm going to figure this fibro thing out. I'm going to make it an approach that anybody with fibro, whether I get to see them or not, can start the process of reversing these symptoms associated with fibromyalgia. So I wrote a book, my first edition, Treating and Beating Fibromyalgia and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. And in that book, I outline kind of the key things that have to happen for them to be able to get on the right path. So many of them are off on the wrong path and spending a lot of money and a lot of time getting nowhere, working with somebody or working with themselves. And it's very frustrating. They end up losing all hope. I wanted to kind of put here's the map, and here's how you get from point A to point B. This is where you start. Now, that's just the beginning. But what I found for these folks is the first step is getting them going into deep delta wave sleep on a consistent basis. Without doing that, it didn't matter what kind of therapy, what drug, what natural nutraceutical we were using, they were not going to get any type of long-term relief unless we could reestablish that deep restorative sleep. So that was the first big step. And the first really aha moment for me 20 something years ago was learning that if I got that right, then everything would kind of start to fall into place. There was another step and another step and another step.
So, do you have specific strategies in helping? I know that's such a huge problem. Some of our Lyme patients too really struggle with getting that deep sleep. And I advocate a lot of my patients get like a tracking device. Like I use an Oura Ring. Some people use a Fitbit, so you can really see how much light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep you're getting. And it's such a struggle. Is it something that you're doing through, is it meditation, mindfulness, the specific supplements? Do you have things that you found? I know everyone's different and, we're not trying to give you medical advice, but are there certain things that you find really help people get over that hump of getting into that deeper sleep?
Yes. And this is really kind of one way to separate Lyme disease from fibromyalgia, because I think with fibromyalgia, they're low in serotonin across the board. And so serotonin is your happy hormone. It's this brain chemical that raises your pain threshold. It's important for mental clarity. Those with fibromyalgia often have this thing called fibro fog, where they don't think very clearly because they have problems with their mental clarity. Serotonin is very important to help you get into deep restorative sleep. And so individuals with fibro, because they're low in serotonin, this brain chemical, that's where I start by using typically mono amino acid therapy, in particular L-tryptophan, or more often 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is the breakdown of L-tryptophan, plus key nutrients, B vitamins, vitamin C, and magnesium. That combination is what makes serotonin. And by raising that serotonin level, we see that they start to increase their melatonin level by sometimes up to 200%, and can start to reestablish that circadian rhythm, along with taking the 5-HTP and a good multivitamin, a specific one that I've created over the years to make that serotonin reaction happen. Then you're right. Then we use good sleep hygiene, which is, I think, is very important, making sure that as the sun's going down, which is a trigger for you to start to slow down, encourage my patients to turn down the lights, start to disconnect their electronic devices an hour or two before bedtime. Get all electronic devices out of the bedroom. That's really important. Block out curtains if they're real, true hardcore insomniac, which most of these patients really struggle with their sleep and can be a big challenge. I'm a recovering insomniac, so I know what it's like. I used to wake up at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I just lay there for an hour or two, or get up and start my day. I did that for a number of years. I could get away with it when I was younger. Then as I got older, I realized, this is not good. And part of it, I felt like a hypocrite because I'm trying to help my patients get a good night's sleep, realizing the importance of that. And yet I was struggling. A few years ago, I came up with a recipe that really works using a combination of gamma aminobutyric acid, L-theanine, ashwagandha, valerian root, just a little supplement that I developed that for me, it really totally resolved my insomnia issues. And I use that as well with my patients. But, you think about it, every chronic illness out there, if you're not getting a good night's sleep, you're just fueling the flames of that illness.
Yep.
I mean, if you're not getting a good night's sleep, obviously you're going to be tired the next day. And these people hadn't slept well in years, so you can imagine how exhausted they are. If you're not getting a good night's sleep, we know that you increase your inflammatory chemicals by 40%. And you and I know that most everybody that's walking around has got inflammation. I mean, inflammation and stress are the two drivers of every health condition out there. So we know people already got inflammation. Now you increase that by 40%. No wonder they're walking around in a lot of pain. And what we see in fibromyalgia is they have a thing called allodynia, which means low pain threshold. And part of that is due to this low serotonin, because when serotonin level's low, we get an increase of this thing called substance P, a hormone called substance P, which creates more pain. And so big thing for fibro is raising that pain threshold. And we do that by increasing the serotonin level with 5-HTP. So to me, though, it doesn't matter if I'm working with a Lyme patient. I work with Lyme patients as well, usually in combination with their fibro. But it really doesn't matter. That's the place I always start, is making sure that they're getting deep restorative sleep on a consistent basis. Because if you do that, a lot of the symptoms are going to start to improve.
Great. So after we get the sleep under control, what's sort of the next step for folks?
Well, so the next step is really shoring up any nutritional deficiencies. So we know that everyone has nutritional deficiencies. The U.S. government came out years ago and said that 70% of the population is deficient in at least one B vitamin, oftentimes as many as 3 or 4. Now, let me preface that when they say you're deficient, they're using the RDA, okay, the recommended dietary allowance, which you and I know really is inadequate for creating optimal health. In fact, I call the RDA the recommended disease allowance. It's just enough to keep you from getting scurvy or beriberi.
Yeah, the bare
It's really
minimum to survive.
Yeah, it's not going to move the needle
Right.
towards health. We are as different on the inside as we are on the outside. And because of that, one person may need 500 milligrams of magnesium for them to get the optimal level to, and as you know, magnesium's in 300 bodily processes. And it's really important in the fibromyalgia community because it's a natural muscle relaxer. It also is important for making the neurotransmitters, the brain chemicals, including serotonin. But it also helps for those individuals who have irritable bowel and are constipated. So one person can take 500 milligrams and all of a sudden their constipation is corrected. Now they're having a bowel movement every day. Another person, though, if they take 100 milligrams of magnesium, they're in the bathroom all day. They have loose bowel movements. So we know that there's a difference, in how well or how poorly somebody can tolerate some of these essential nutrients. So the second step really is shoring up any nutritional deficiencies with the right doses and combinations of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and essential fatty acids. And a big part of that for the fibro is getting the mitochondria, the power plants of the cells, to work correctly. CoQ10, L-carnitine, acetyl L-carnitine, malic acid, magnesium, these things that deliver the nutrients needed to make these mitochondria work. The next step, if I can go ahead and I'll just wrap this up real quick.
Yeah,
and
please.
we'll see. The next step then is shoring up any kind of GI problems. Because as you and I know, as functional medicine practitioners, the health really is is tied to the gut. So many of these individuals have either leaky gut or yeast overgrowth or food allergies, something you're very familiar with. They have malabsorption syndrome where they're not digesting their food. They have reflux and bloating, gas, SIBO. They have all these different things going on. And if we don't start to correct these GI problems, then they're like the hamster on the wheel. They're just running, in circles because these GI issues are creating inflammation, creating the pain. Last, but certainly not least, is adrenal fatigue. So these individuals have bankrupted their stress coping chemicals, and that's why they need these high doses sometimes of these vitamins and minerals, amino acids, and essential fatty acids. But they've also put so much stress on their stress coping glands, the adrenal glands, that they find that they're depleted in these hormones they need to be able to handle stress. So stress becomes more magnified. Bright lights, loud noises, real or imagined stress, it doesn't matter. They can't handle it, and they get to the point that it gets so bad that for some of them, they can't even leave the house because they can't deal with the outside world. So the last but not least is shoring up any problems with their adrenal glands, partly due because if we don't, then if they have a day where they feel good, and that could be a rarity, but if they have a day where they feel good and they go try to do something that you and I would take for granted, going out with friends for lunch or doing something in the garden or staying an extra hour at work if they're still working, can send them over the edge. And then they're in a thing called, they have a fibro flare that puts them in bed for 2 or 3 days. So those are really kind of the what I talk about, the 4 corners of the puzzle, right? You want to get those 4 corners of the puzzle right, and then you can start to put the puzzle together. But until you get to 4 corners, you're really going to struggle with figuring out this puzzle, which is your health puzzle.
I think everyone listening, as you're walking through these steps and you're talking about mitochondrial dysfunction, adrenal dysfunction. I mean, most people with Lyme disease and these co-infections are going ding, 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 ding. That's me. We know that Lyme disease can directly damage your mitochondria. And if you've been on long-term antibiotics, most of these antibiotics damage the mitochondria. So when you're chronically fatigued and in pain and your tissue doesn't recover as quickly as possible, a lot of that is because your mitochondria aren't functioning nearly as well as they need to.
Yeah.
And of course, the adrenal piece, we know that Lyme can cause thyroid problems, it can cause adrenal problems, reproductive hormone problems, and just the stress of being sick, the toll it takes on you and your friends and your family and your loved ones. It's a lot for so many people. And I have a lot of Lyme patients, again, that are become kind of night owls, not because they want to, but because their cortisol levels get so out of kilter that now, 9, 10 o'clock hits and, they've been tired all day long and they can barely function, but they get that little burst of at least mental energy that they have a hard time sleeping. And maybe that's when they can be productive. So, we're seeing so many parallels between fibromyalgia and Lyme. And again, so many of my patients kind of have both. Yeah. And I think, you and I are approaching this in very much the same mindset that, it's not really just treat that one thing. We got to look at all these underlying factors, looking at mitochondrial health, looking at gut function, looking at adrenal function and thyroid and all these other pieces, because it's the whole of the person that gets you over that hurdle and really gets you starting to feel well. I want to ask you a little bit too about like diet specifically. I talk about in my book, I've kind of promote an alkaline diet just based on what I did for myself when I had Lyme disease and looking at the research. Is there anything specific for fibro that you recommend for your folks?
Absolutely. So for me, the paleo diet is probably the one I think is probably the one that people do the best on. Now, the keto diet can be helpful as well, but really getting those grains out of their diet, definitely limiting or eliminating simple carbohydrates or sugars, which create inflammation, can be a real game changer. A lot of the patients that I work with, Darren, are carrying around a lot of extra weight from a sedentary lifestyle because just this, don't have the energy to do to lose that weight. Part of it is the medications sometimes that they're taking. It's not unusual when I start working with a patient, they're on half a dozen or a dozen drugs, because in the conventional world, what it's about is treating the symptoms. So with fibro, there's so many daggum symptoms. The same thing with Lyme. that, before you know it, they're on half a dozen or a dozen drugs, a drug to put them to sleep, a drug to wake them up, a drug to slow them down, a drug to speed them up, or all these things. So it's easy, this oftentimes it's an easy next step that their metabolism becomes compromised. It can sabotage their thyroid, and next thing you know, they're gaining weight from the medication or just from the metabolism being so low. And I find that having them be on an anti-inflammatory diet, kind of based around similar like a paleo, although I've created it's called 2Transform. It's a special diet for my patients to help them lose weight. And part of that is combined with food allergy testing. So
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that we need to know if there are any foods that we're eating on a daily basis that could be creating some of the symptoms that we have. But with fibro, oftentimes these people are really healthy, and they share their story, and you hear their story with Lyme too. They're exercise enthusiasts. They're working 40-hour work weeks. They're incredibly healthy people. Then something comes along, typically some type of stressor, and then they start to develop symptoms, maybe a few symptoms, aches and pains here and there. Then they start to have a little bit of fatigue. Their sleep becomes compromised, and that's where it all goes downhill. And then next thing you know, they're, after going to doctor after doctor to doctor, they finally get this diagnosis of fibromyalgia. But as that illness continues to rear its ugly head, they find that more and more things start to show up, and they become more and more sensitive. So they find that foods that they used to be able to eat, they can't eat anymore. Or things they used to do physically, they can't do anymore. It sets them off. Or maybe they start to develop hay fever, never had seasonal allergies. Now they have seasonal allergies. And this is also part of putting that puzzle together, is we see that, we get the four corners, but there's other things that have to happen. You mentioned thyroid. Thyroid's a big one for these. I find that 60 to 70% of my patients with fibro have a problem with their thyroid that's never been properly diagnosed or is not being properly treated. Also, and I hate to admit it, but I will admit it, the first Lyme case I ever had 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it's been a long time, caught me by surprise. I had a patient with fibro, and I did every test you can imagine on her and never could get her out of pain. Had everything going in the right direction for her. Sleeping great, moods were stabilized, mental clarity was pretty good, energy was pretty good, cleaned up, no pun intended, or IBS or some of these issues that she had. Never occurred to me, Darren, to check for Lyme disease at that time. It was just not on my radar. And I feel bad because, I told her eventually after a period of time, so, you know what, Mandy, I don't know what else to do for you. I don't have anything else for you. And I felt bad. And looking back on it too, I also had this, and I feel guilty, I had this mentality that there's no way she could still have that pain. Something, we've tested all these tests, we've tried all these things that work for everybody else. So I was guilty of being one of those physicians that blamed it on the patient. Now, I don't do that anymore. And usually I catch those who have Lyme and fibro, because there's, the symptoms are so similar. I catch it in the interview. I can catch that in an interview pretty quickly, but now routinely test just to make sure I'm not missing anything that's a piece of the puzzle that if I don't get that right, we're not going to be able to put the rest of it together.
Well, we're all human, and I think every doctor, I know every doctor, we've all been guilty of thinking that a patient made up a symptom, or they just weren't right about what's going on, and we miss things as much as we try. And again, this is why they call it practice. I mean, we're learning from you every day. I mean, what I did early in my career, I don't do most of that now, because we learned either it didn't work or there were other better ways to approach it. And that's the benefit of experience of just doing a lot of this over and over. I mean, you treat a lot of fibro folks, I treat a lot of Lyme folks. We get to see again, what works for most of the people, what's likely to be beneficial, what's likely to be harmful. And
Right.
we keep constantly adjusting our process to fine tune it so that we really are able to present you with the best approach with the least possibility of having any kind of adverse side effects. So I appreciate you sharing and being honest with that, because again, it happens to the best of us, and in our best effort to help everyone get better, sometimes we overlook things, and it happens. So I
We-
appreciate you
we-
sharing that.
Well, I appreciate that. And you know what? It changes. I mean, what I was doing even 10 years ago, which was, fibromyalgia patient, oh, that's slam dunk, no problem. Now, and I think the universe at large kind of sends you these people once you kind of get comfortable with a select type of, these are the linchpins. If you do that, they're going to be fine. Well, now we're seeing so many people, not only, Lyme is a big one, Lyme is big, but the other one is mold.
Right.
A few years ago, I'd have mold here and there. Now it seems like everybody I test has mold.
Yeah.
And Neil Nathan was on my Fibro Summit, which, I interviewed you for that. It was a great interview that we did together. And I was talking to Neil. I said, Neil, what are you seeing different about fibromyalgia? He's been in, Neil Nathan, and wrote, you familiar with him,
Yep.
the book Toxic. I highly recommend it. And he wrote a book about fibromyalgia too, or chronic illness. And so I asked, I said, Neil, what are you seeing different in the fibromyalgia patient that you weren't seeing maybe 5 or 6 years ago? And he said, well, it used to be, he named it, rattled off a couple of things, but now it's Lyme. Lyme is big now, and so is mold.
Yep.
And I said, are you kidding me? That's exactly what I'm seeing. But it took me a few years to realize this pattern that I'm seeing. So many people are getting diagnosed with fibro, but when you look at them, you see one of the main triggers, it's mold. Or what's one of the main triggers now? It's Lyme. And again, I go back to, you see someone that's really not, doing pretty well, doing okay, then something comes along that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they develop these symptoms we call fibro. But if you look deeper, you see that one of the triggers for them is Lyme that may have been there for years. They never had an issue with it, but they got under too much stress, and now Lyme is rearing its ugly head. Or, it could be Epstein-Barr virus, or which we see in Lyme too, Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus, these herpes viruses that are comorbidities, things that are giving you issues. And previously, and I never, people talked about Epstein-Barr virus. That's all I heard 22 years ago. I rarely found it in my fibro patients. In my chronic T syndrome patients, yes, but rarely in fibro. Now, guess what? Now I'm having to test everybody for, Epstein-Barr virus antibodies to see if, oh yeah, maybe there's an Epstein-Barr virus that's been there dormant, and now it's starting to give this individual issues because they've gotten so run down. So it changes too, and I think to me, that's both a challenge, but it's also really a lot of fun, because you have to really stay up on what's out there, what's happening. And we're so toxic now, right? I mean, gosh, we're so toxic, and that's driving a lot of these illnesses.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I've had a similar discussion with Dr. Nathan, and I think we're all in agreement that our world's more toxic. Things that used to be, I say easier to treat, it was never easy, but
Yeah,
easier. It's becoming
right,
so much harder, and whether it's
right.
fibro, Lyme disease, autism, things that I used to see progress much more quickly with people, now we're seeing it's taking 2, 3 times as long to get to the endpoint, because again, we're constantly battling this toxic exposure. Mold, like you mentioned, is a huge one, but
Yeah,
it's pesticides and herbicides. I mean, I live in Southern California, where we're in a big bowl of pollution, and it just, this accumulates over time, and it makes our cells weaker. It makes them less efficient at doing what they're designed to do. So again, we keep doing our best efforts to detoxify in different ways,
right.
but I always think of it's like filling up a bathtub and draining at the same time. Which process goes faster? If we can drain it faster than it fills up, we're good. But if it
Yeah,
fills up faster and we can drain it, it overflows and we start to have problems. So
right,
it's
right.
really, again, about trying to lower that body burden on your body as much as possible. So I always advise, go for that low hanging fruit, clean up your home, get all the chemicals out, be careful
Yeah,
what you put on your body, what you're putting in your mouth. All these kind of things do help over time.
yeah,
But again, it has been a bit more challenging in the last decade. to deal with some of these chronic illnesses as
Yeah.
efficiently. I want to ask you a little bit too about exercise and movement. So many people with fibro, Lyme disease, because of the pain, because of the stiffness, they really struggle to move. I mean, so how important is it? And do you have good strategies to help people get some element of movement in their life?
Well, so fibro, I use this analogy that we're all born with a stress coping savings account. I kind of mentioned that earlier. And in that stress coping savings account, we have certain chemicals that allow us to deal with stress, hormones and vitamins and minerals and these things that the body uses to be able to make these chemical reactions to deal with stress, real or imagined. For fibro, they bankrupted that stress coping savings account, so they don't have those chemicals. And as I mentioned earlier, they have adrenal fatigue, so their stress coping glands are shot. So stress really can set them back, and they have these things called fibro flares. Exercise, which is a really healthy thing, is a stress. It's a healthy stress, but for fibro, it's not something that I recommend when I start working with them initially. Although it has to be put in the equation for getting healthy, because it's like diet. You can't be healthy with an unhealthy diet. Eventually it's going to catch up with you. You can't get to health. You can't be as healthy as you want to be with an unhealthy diet. And exercise is so important for fibromyalgia, in particularly because they have a problem with, as I mentioned earlier, mitochondria. Genetically, just the way God made them, many of them don't have as many mitochondria, and the mitochondria that they have are decoupled. They're not working correctly. So the mitochondria, as I mentioned earlier, are the power plants of the cells. They give the cells energy, but they also communicate with other cells, and they're driving these reactions inside a cell. They're these little organelles that are in there. One of the best ways to optimize your mitochondria energy and to build more mitochondria is exercise. So it's something that can be a game changer, but in the beginning, until I can get that individual going in a deeper restorative sleep, start to fix some of these underlying problems with their stress coping deficiencies, chemical deficiencies, I don't even start that. Now I'll get them to start moving, because even moving can create additional metabolic energy, and it can create more mitochondria energy. Movement that stimulates the vagal nerve is very important, because the vagal nerve is our main nerve to drive parasympathetic reactions, our calming reactions. With fibro, they're mostly driven by sympathetic reactions, so they're just this wired and tired all the time, which is incredibly exhausting, and creates a lot of inflammation and pain. So yes, that's a great question, but the answer is it's got to be done in the right way, and it's got to be structured so that the individual doesn't try to go out and exercise and then have a fibro flare and then feel guilty because they can't do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I advocate for, like, I like the idea of movement versus exercise. I think when people think
Yeah,
of
yeah,
exercise, like, oh my God, I got to go to the
yeah,
gym, I got to lift weights, I can't, and like my body's just not going to happen.
yeah,
And when I was in the throes of Lyme and I was exhausted, I mean, if someone said you need to go to the gym, I would have laughed in their face. I'm like, not going to happen. So I would plop in front of the floor and watch TV, and I would just stretch.
yeah,
Just stretch. And it didn't
yeah,
seem like much, but from there it progressed that I would start just kind of doing laps around the house, and then it was laps around the neighborhood, and eventually got to a point where I started martial arts and I got a black belt in karate. So it took 8 years to get to that point,
yeah,
but the idea of movement, because you're moving your blood flow, you're moving your lymph. That's a good way we detoxify, and
yeah,
just mentally. It's
right,
really, I think, helpful just to have some element of movement. So don't feel like it has to be anything hardcore. It doesn't sometimes even have to be that long. I have people that do, gentle things like yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong. I have
yeah,
people that then do like the little mini trampoline and just kind of bounce on it.
yeah, the
So
bouncers,
there's
yeah,
a lot of creative ways to get movement in your life that we may not necessarily consider exercise. But as your fitness level improves, as your energy improves, as your pain levels improve, I think just, think about having some daily movement, because again, I think that's going to move the needle a lot faster.
yeah, yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's got to be done the right way, but anybody can move, and I take a similar approach, is just getting them stretching in the beginning, and then it could be, once they're doing better, we start to get those four corners of the puzzle, and then we can be a little more aggressive. And aggressive would be maybe, walking 5 minutes a day. And then you do that for a week, and then you build up, and then it's 7 minutes. And then a couple of weeks later, now you're at 10. But eventually the idea is to get in the habit of doing something every day that does stress your body. So you build up that resistance, because they've lost that neuroplasticity. They don't have the ability to rebound. They can't rebound from stress. They don't have the resistance or stamina. And the only way you create that is by facing a stressful situation, including exercise, and then increasing that, getting over it, getting used to it, and then challenging it again.
Well, as usual, Roger, this has been a fantastic talk. You've always got great pearls of wisdom to share with everyone around fibro. And I know so many people with Lyme disease have been struggling with this. I know people tuning in are going to be interested in maybe wanting to work with you. Where's a great place for people to find you?
Well, thanks, Darren. This is my favorite topic. I wish we didn't have to talk about fibro. When I'm on these summits and podcasts, people say, "Oh, I appreciate you being here," and I always say, "Well, this is my favorite topic, but I wish we didn't have to have it." The place to go is your fibro doctor spelled out.com, and there's all kind of free reports on there that you'll find interesting. Some free videos about the jumpstart process, which are the four corners of the puzzle. I go into detail, 10 minutes each, I think, of these videos. So not a big time investment, but go into more detail. We kind of understand this process, what we're trying to do with fibro.
Well, always a pleasure, Roger. We really appreciate you spending time with everyone on the summit and sharing your information. So again, thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Darren. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.